So one of the things about the numbers from Greater Minnesota, we just really appreciate that Wilder does this research and that Commissioner Solom kind of inspired it to be statewide. One of the challenges we've had in Greater Minnesota, and in rural Minnesota especially, is there's no money for outreach. And when there's no money for outreach, we can't prove that homelessness exists. And when we can't prove that homelessness exists, there's very little services money to do anything about it. And when there's very little services money to do anything about it, we can't build capacity in our communities to address it. And without capacity, we can't do outreach. And that circle just continues over and over again. And so, as Dr. Owen said in his presentation, 48% of the people surveyed for this study in Greater Minnesota were found through outreach. And so, it kind of baffles the mind, really, on how this outreach happened. Much of it through volunteer, but I can tell you that I've been assigned, like, Cook County, all of Cook County, with me in my car and one helper, to drive around and look for folks. And that's kind of how many people all across rural Minnesota have been found over the years for this study. There's also been coordinated efforts in recent years. We've scheduled Project Homeless Connects to be on the day of the survey, which is really just very smart. We don't call them Homeless Connect because people in rural areas, Greater Minnesota, we don't think of ourselves as homeless because that's an urban thing. So we call it Operation Community Connect, but it's the same idea. Some of the folks who come are homeless and we get to survey them. We've also done tons of outreach in the rural areas with, cool thing about rural areas is we're related to everybody. And so, like the mail carrier and the county grader guy that drives down the roads, like they're all our brothers and sisters and uncles and cousins. And so we're able to ask, everybody says like, hey, do you know a place where there's like a boarded up tarp shack or something? And so there's been some of the outreach has come about that way as well. And so it's been a lot of really hard creative work, all in the desperate effort to get financial resources to Greater Minnesota to address it. Unfortunately, that's where we've got the numbers now, we just don't have the funds yet. And I asked yesterday a bunch of the Continuum of Care coordinators from Greater Minnesota if, what I should tell you all about what our gaps are. And they said, if you talk to a group of metro area people and tell them we need more shelters, they're gonna think you're backwards and kind of dumb. But do it anyway, because we really do. And so the fact is that you can drive hundreds of miles without any shelter, any transitional housing program, any drop-in center in Greater Minnesota. And so while I agree that maybe in the metro area we have enough shelters and our job needs to be to get people rapidly rehoused out of those shelters, in Greater Minnesota, there aren't any of those services. And so there has to be some place to get people. And if you can imagine, those of you who work in the homeless services world in the metro area, if there were no shelters and no transitional housing, and we had the same supply of supportive housing we have, already you're turning away tons of folks who call for services. If you got rid of all the shelters and transitional housing and had those same folks calling, that's what we're faced with in rural Minnesota, is we just tell them, well, if you can catch a ride down to Duluth, or if you can catch a ride up to Rochester, or if you can catch a ride to the cities, that's the solution. And so the Government Accountability Office from Washington was doing a study on rural homelessness, and they came to Minnesota to find out, because we work so well, kind of a model for the nation on how well people are working together in rural Minnesota. And they came and we heard stories, we brought them to talk with folks who have just had to make do with what they have. And so I live up on the Iron Range, and so up there, the mine pits, it's a really steep down, but if you can get yourself and your kids and a pallet down there, you can make some firewood and build a little tent and stay there for a little while. But those kids, they're not getting to school. So anyway, lots of challenges. I would say that across the whole state, but especially in Greater Minnesota and rural Minnesota, we need to fund the entire continuum from prevention and outreach, shelter, transitional housing, supportive housing, affordable housing, subsidized housing. We just need to do it all, and we need to do it in this economy where there's no money. This state budget shortfall was $1.2 billion this year, out of a $31 billion budget for the state. We were short $1 billion, and out of that, what they proposed doing was eliminating health care for low-income people, eliminating cash assistance for single adults, who can't work, dramatic cuts to families on public assistance, eliminating emergency general assistance, and that was with just a $1.2 billion shortfall. Next year, we're looking at 7 to 9. Fortunately, this year, we learned how to fight back, and we learned that it's really a lot of fun. Ken's up here in the front row, kind of headed some of the outreach efforts, and what we learned from Kenza and others is that every action has to be a craft project. And we've learned that very similar thing from the Youth Moving Forward folks last year in fighting for funding for the Runaway Homeless Youth Act. And so advocacy has gotten really fun, and I would encourage you all to become a part of it. I know many of you did, but just some examples of what worked this year. We all worked together. The folks who serve just single adults joined together to support the folks who serve families, and we all stood together and we said no. No cuts. None. We don't care how bad your budget is. And then, we believe they can raise revenues, or there's other things we can do. We can certainly always get smarter about our services. But so we had craft projects where we made Mother's Day cards from homeless moms and brought them to the committee, and they looked at them as they were trying to decide how much, if they should whack them another $100, they should take your car away or what. And we ended up, the story ends, GAMC isn't quite as fixed as we would have liked it to be, but we saved cash assistance for single adults. We need to start raising that. $203 ain't enough to get a place to live anywhere in this state. We prevented the MFIP cuts, family welfare cuts from happening. One of the things I want to say too about Greater Minnesota is we've seen in the metro area the heading home plans and have had a coordinator, and some of the coordinators are here doing brilliant work. We also have coordinators in Greater Minnesota doing brilliant work. One of them is here, but they're not paid. We don't have full-time paid people coordinating the work in Greater Minnesota, and we just need that so desperately. It's great to have volunteers do it who also have a full-time job doing something else, but it's not enough. We've seen in the metro area how we can combine private and public resources, get a bunch of leverage volunteer efforts, a lot of great minds together, but it takes coordination, sometimes two full people coordinating that, two full-time jobs. We also, similarly, in the metro areas, entitlement counties, we have a full-time continuum of care coordinator who does very similar thing and tries to get federal resources. In Greater Minnesota, we don't. We have $13,000 per region. A region is sometimes 20 counties, and it's just a ton of work, and it's something we can do. I want to speak just a little bit to the racism discrepancies. There's a lot of Native American folks where I live, and sometimes thinking about how we end institutional racism and how we just end racism overall is overwhelming. But there's so many things we could do as advocates. For example, some of the federal funding for homeless programs say you can't apply if you're a tribal government. It's so blatant, and we could just decide to get together and say no. And that's what we encourage you to join us in. I just want to thank Erica who started us off and encourage everyone to check out Students Guide to Ending Homelessness. It really has great just hands-on advice for how you can do, and it's great. It's written by students, for students, great for churches, other groups. Fun things you can do, making blankets, things like that, but also advocacy and things like that you can do, writing letters to the editor, and it's very hands-on, very wonderful, and you'll all get the link for it later on. Thank you. Oh, and women especially, let me have a word with you. I'll be very brief, but let me tell you that I have been on the side of receiving programs and not enough to help our family when we needed them. Been on that side, a recipient of services. I've been on the advocacy side, asking government to do a little something more. And then I've been on the elected official side. And let me tell you, the elected official side is the coolest side to be on.